right, y'all. So part two to the importance of sacrifice. We're talking biblically, and internally. All right. So I left off on point four, on point five. Okay. So in the last video, I ended with the old sacrificing was the old sacrificing was through slaughtering animals and shedding blood. So if you're making it to this part two, you need to go back on my page and view the part one. Okay. So the new sacrificing now is internal sacrificing, becoming new within. So what is a part of the power of the blood in us today that requires an internal sacrifice is our DNA. Our DNA, which is in our blood, needs to be altered, needs to be shed. You know, your DNA can actually be reprogrammed in your blood. So when you're doing things like transforming and healing and becoming a new person, you literally are changing your DNA. So the current act of sacrifice to become new or atone yourself or become one with Christ again is to in a way change your DNA, is to in a way change your mindset, changing inside of your flesh, your blood. That's why so many people talk about ancestral curses and being the black sheep of the line, or being the some people call it the chosen one, and it's something else I'm trying to come up with here that we talk about. But literally becoming the one that changes the DNA, that frees your ancestry from sin. So in this case, your ancestry sin might have been hustling, bustling, allowing themselves to be slaves when Jesus gave himself up so you didn't have to do that. Right? With Exodus, when they got them up out of Exodus, up out of the slavery of Egypt, we literally are sinning by putting ourselves willingly back into that just because man says that's what we have to do. So when we're changing our DNA and we're internally sacrificing the blood of which holds the sin of that stuff, we're becoming whole again. We are being forgiven and cleansed of our sins in a way through the blood, but without having to slaughter anymore. We do it within now. Alright. So another question that I came up with while doing my research is, why couldn't the word be used instead of blood? Like, why couldn't God or Jesus just be like, okay, by my word you are cleansed, right? Because God has that power to do it. So why still the use of blood and the use of slaughter to atone for sin? So this is what Gemini told me. The word creates. So the word made flesh, which we learn about. The word, we speak things into existence, right? But the blood is what redeems. So we're going back, like I was talking about in the first video, the blood is the redeemer because it's the currency. Now in our current day, we use physical money and cash as currency, or we use our phones as currency. Some people are using like Bitcoin and things like that. We use that as currency to pay for things. So I think I'm going to go into that on the next page, like as far as debt, for example. Like in one video I did, I was talking about spiritual debt. Everything comes from the spirit, right? So in this case, we are paying for a debt. And in our physical realities, we pay our debts with what? We pay it with physical currency. And how do we get that physical currency? By the blood, sweat, and tears of our work. The first thing of that statement is the blood. We're using our blood to physically pay by going in these jobs and working and busting ass so we can pay for rents and currency, not rent and currency, rent and bills and everything. But in this case, spiritually, blood currency would be used to pay for these things, for our spiritual debts. So continuing, when physical bodies break the law, the defilement becomes materialized. The word can't pay a physical debt, a physical biological debt. So basically, no, you cannot use the word to pay the debt because the word is still something unmanifest until it's manifest, but the word itself is unmanifest. The word itself is spiritual or it's unseen. So you can't pay for something physical, like a physical sin that you did with your own body or your blood, which is in your blood now, of the action. Blood with it. The first thing that came to mind when I was like really processing this was blood in, blood out. You might have heard that term, blood in, blood out. So blood in the sin that you was doing. So to pay for it, blood got to come out. It's like an even exchange of the same thing. Some people use that term because, like, say for like, I don't know if they use it for like gang activity or whatever. Blood in, blood out. It's something where blood got to go in, blood got to shed. If you coming out, blood got to shed. You blood, you coming in, but to come out is blood. It's the same thing with like debt and bloodshed. Okay, so continuing on to that, physical debt paid by your blood, sweat, and tears. Oh, I just said that. That was pretty much an example that I gave. By when you're paying a physical debt, you're using your blood, sweat, and tears to pay for it. Also, you might pick up overtime. You might work 2 and 3 jobs, be able to get that debt paid, those bills paid. That's how you're paying for it. You're paying for it with your body, with the blood in your body, and the essences of the rest of the stuff, like the sweat and the tears. So continuing on, blood is a physical container for life force, which I mentioned in the first video. Spilling it is the literal spending of that asset. So again, it's an asset because it's a currency that you get paid with, in this case of sacrifice. Excuse me. It is the ultimate payment. When an innocent, uncorrupted life willingly pours out its blood, that massive amount of pure life force enters the cosmic ledger, satisfying the legal demand of the law of decay. That's how Gemini put it. But basically, again, Jesus was uncorrupted. He came straight from the spirit, incarnated into physicality. So for him to give up his blood was the ultimate currency because he was pure. Everybody else was contaminated from sin, starting off with the line of Adam and Eve, and then opening that door to good and evil, which caused people to have to labor and have pains and go through all this struggle until they died. They would have to do that until they died. So again, at some point I want to even do a video on the lost books of Adam and Eve, because the Bible we read now talks about it. Pretty much just goes from them being kicked out of the garden straight into when they had kids, right? Cain and Abel and such. But there was a whole story in between. There was a whole story of the journey that Adam and Eve had to do to come back to Christ. They had to literally go into a cave, almost like a middle part of like the heaven and hell that they were going to be cast to, and with the grinding, the hustling, the labor pains and everything else. They had to pretty much be incubated again. They had to learn. They had to kind of go into I don't know what you would call it, almost like a I can't think of the word. I mean, knowing the word, but I can't think of it. But basically, they had to learn again why they sinned, and they had to come back as a whole. There's a whole story on that. And that's where Jesus made the covenant with them that after they completed a certain amount of time in this cave, in this wilderness, that he would incarnate to save the rest of humanity from their sins. Because up until a certain point, they told him that he had quite a few generations to go before that was happening, before Jesus came. So they had to go through all of that, what was said, until Jesus came and said, okay, he had to even go through his own path before that occurred. Okay, so lastly, my last note here as we're closing up. When you accept the sacrifice of Christ, a spiritual blood transfusion takes place. That's how Gemini put that. So when you're doing a blood transfusion, you're putting in good blood and into the next body to redeem them. Like when you're giving up blood to somebody who might be dying or needs new blood, you're redeeming them by giving up your blood. So I hope all that makes sense. Again, check out the first part of the video if you missed it, and I'll see y'all later.